the notion of reopening of schools, we are joined by Dr. Andrea Juan, who is a research specialist in the Inclusive Economic Development Research Division at the Human Science Research Council. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Based on the assertion by the World Health Organization that schools should only be open during the low local transmission in any country. So, coming to South Africa, do you think that schools reopened prematurely?
I think the first thing about the situation is that it is an emotional situation and it is quite a complex situation. On the part of the government, I think that any steps that they had taken, whether it would be to keep schools closed or to open them, would have been met with some kind of opposition. Parents are worried about the safety of their children. Teachers are worried about their own health. And I think that the government, in its decision to open schools, did so on the best available science at the time and has used a risk-adjusted strategy. I think that what's really important to remember is that our educational system is so unequal. With the closure of schools, it is your middle-class child who is able to continue learning at home through online avenues. But the majority of our children, who are the poor children, were not able to continue. And so schooling and learning essentially stopped for them. And so I think it's these children that we need to be concerned about. And the question is, how do we cater for this sector of our learners who are the majority, who need that structure from schooling and who need schooling for other things such as the nutrition system, where this is the only meal that they will get for the day.
Looking at the high risk of infection when schools are open, I mean, looking at the build-up of a reopening of schools where government was preparing for the fumigation of schools and also preparing that the learners should get face masks and being sanitized. But when schools reopened, we saw the infection rate at various centers throughout the country, going at a very high rate. And one was asking oneself, why at such a pace when we hadn't reached the peak season? Now that we are at the peak season, do you think that the Department of Education should consider closing all the schools now? And perhaps, as others are suggesting, that they should re-look at the curriculum this year and looking at the pre-examination preparation as well?
Yes, so I think the issue about the curriculum is one that the department has taken seriously. The curriculum will be streamlined, and in my opinion, we should just focus on reading, writing, and numeracy skills as fundamentals across all grades. And as we know, South African achievement is generally low, and so we could actually use this time just to consolidate those foundations of reading, writing, and arithmetic.
When we talk about another issue that is very interesting here, some parents don't really know much when it comes to homeschooling, and they say that they've never done it before. As they are exploring this notion, what needs to be done? I mean, like homeschooling for you may not be the same for me, and our children could be in the same standard. Then who would you attribute the excellent or poor performance of the child to?
Yes, I think the issue here is that schools should not have expected parents to take on the role of the teacher. And I think a lot of learners suddenly realized how little their parents knew or remembered from going to school. And this has placed a lot of stress on parents because they're having to do domestic duties. Some of them are working from home, and now they're being put on to becoming teachers and homeschoolers. But I do think that if parents are considering homeschooling as an alternative, it isn't a step that should be taken lightly, and they should really investigate and research this. Homeschooling takes a lot of resources, and therefore it is your more middle-class learners that could continue homeschooling. It takes time from the parents, and we must remember that children still need social interaction and social engagement. So when considering homeschooling, parents need to take all these factors into account.
Right. So what can the government do when we come to a time where there is a low infection rate and children being able to go back to school? When we looked at the build-up, you found that some schools didn't receive face masks on time, and others were not fumigated. So there wasn't really a comprehensive view regarding the preparations of the school buildings for resumption of education activities. Well, what needs to be done? Do you think that government has learned a lesson in terms of coming up with an even preparation for resumption of classes?
Yes, I think the one thing that this COVID or the schools closing as a result of COVID has shown us how deep the inequalities in our education system are. Those schools who could prepare themselves and had adequate sanitation, facilities for washing your hands, and bigger classrooms so that social distancing could happen, have carried on. It's your poor resource schools, those schools who still didn't have proper toilet facilities or facilities to wash hands, whose classrooms are smaller, and so social distancing becomes an issue there. This COVID pandemic has just unmasked how deep those inequalities actually are. And I think it's incumbent on the department to make sure that schools have this basic infrastructure so that when something like a pandemic hits, they are more equipped to handle it and to respond adequately.
Just to pick your brain on this, there's something that is very devastating to contemplate here. When you look at the stakeholders in the Department of Education talking about the rollout of infrastructure programs, and there's School A that has all facilities and School B that doesn't have toilets, no water and everything, what's happening in their minds when they are deliberating on the rollout program? And it's been years and years and more than 25 years that some of these schools don't have what we are talking about. When is it going to happen? When are we going to see that being delivered so that we don't have schools that don't have toilets, that don't have water, that don't have electricity? And looking at the digital divide, we're not even ready as a country for e-learning in any rural area or township to that effect. So what are the relevant stakeholders talking about, and what are they disagreeing to agree about?
Oh, that's a very complex issue, and you're right. It has been so many years since the advent of democracy, and it shouldn't be 25 years later where we still have children dying because they fell into a pit latrine, and this is not an isolated incident. There are a number of children who have drowned in pit latrines, and there are many schools that don't have basic infrastructure. I think this is something that the government has made progress on, but it isn't enough. There have been a number of court cases where a national norms and standards of school infrastructure has been set, and we need to hold the government, and especially the Department of Basic Education, to account for this. You're right, it has been too many years with some learners just being left behind because their schools have none of this infrastructure that we take for granted in our middle class neighborhoods.
Right. Thank you very much for making time to speak to us. It's Dr. Andrea Juan, who is Human Sciences Research Council specialist, and talking to us about what can be done about the reopening of schools, and also the views about government effort to try and level the playing field regarding providing infrastructure for different schools.